The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm Kathy Morrison, Director of the Center for International Studies, and I want to welcome you to our third event in our series on food security and insecurity for the spring quarter of this year. I would remind you, those of you who attended previous events in the series, that we have an ongoing Twitter discussion, and the hashtag is CIS Food Security, all one word, so if you want to participate in that way, you're certainly welcome to do so. Our co-sponsor tonight, helping us with the recording of tonight's event, is the University Communications Office. Today we have a special and very important event in our series in which we're going to discuss some alternative intellectual frameworks for thinking about these issues, and especially the concept of food sovereignty, with a very distinguished panel of scholars here today. So our format is this, a little different from our usual routine. We'll have three speakers, as you can tell, so each person will speak, and then I'll play host, and we'll have a kind of moderated panel discussion up here. So we will not have questions from the audience, as we often do, but there will, of course, be time afterwards to chat, and of course you can always use technology, such as Twitter and so on, to interject your own perspectives. So let me just introduce our three speakers all together at the beginning. We have, from this end of the table toward me, Professor Hannah Whitman, who's an assistant professor of sociology and a member of the Latin American Studies program at Simon Fraser University. She conducts collaborative research on local food systems, food sovereignty, and agrarian citizenship with the Landless Rural Workers Movement and La Via Campesina in Brazil, and with community farming networks in British Columbia. She's the co-editor of Food Sovereignty, Reconnecting Food, Nature, and Community, Food Sovereignty in Canada, and Environment and Citizenship in Latin America, Nature's Subjects and Struggles. The title of her talk tonight is Peasants' Rights or Food Riots, The Challenges of Institutionalizing Food Sovereignty. Professor Rachel Besner-Kerr is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Western Ontario and the research coordinator of the Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities Project in Malawi. She conducts community-based research on the linkages between social and environmental inequalities in agriculture, health and nutrition, work that's done in collaboration with smallholder farmers in a hospital in northern Malawi. Her specific areas of work have included linkages between HIV/AIDS affected families, agricultural practices, food security and health, and something very close to my heart, historical and contemporary perspectives on the increased use of drought-tolerant crops, such as sorghum and millet. Her title tonight is Agroecology and Food Sovereignty in Malawi. And then finally, we have Professor Philip McMichael, who is an international professor in the Department of Development Sociology at Cornell. Trained as an historical sociologist, his research examines capitalist modernity through the lens of agrarian questions, food regimes, agrarian food sovereignty movements, and most recently, the implications for food systems of agrofuels and land grabbing. His work involves consultation with the FAO, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, La Via Campesina, Food First Information and Action Network, and the Eco-Agriculture Partners Project, Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature Initiative. And the title of his talk today is Food Sovereignty versus Food Security, a Global Conundrum. So let's start with Professor Whitman.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you especially to Jamie Bender for organizing this panel and our trip here. It's been really great to come and learn about your programs here. I'm going to talk today about a project that looks at the juxtaposition of an international human rights discourse around the right to food with on-the-ground implementation. Rights talk has a lot of traction in today's environment, and we're going to see how this actually is being worked out. What are the challenges and what are the tensions and different ways of thinking about the right to food? So how does the right to food, which is a predominantly consumerist concern, how do people get food to eat, how does that interact with demands to protect the rights of peasants food producers who actually need land and need markets to be able to provide a living not only for themselves but for their communities. So I've worked with rural agricultural communities in Latin America for almost 2 decades, Brazil, Paraguay, Guatemala, and currently working with local food movements in British Columbia to look at what are the challenges to implementing a food sovereignty framework and what are the implications of this framework for global hunger and environmental sustainability. So food security, the idea of food security as a right emerged in the post-World War II context as a universal ideal to end world hunger. It was enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. On the screen you see a quote from the 1974 Universal Declaration on the Eradication of Hunger and Malnutrition. This is from the first UN-sponsored World Food Summit, where Henry Kissinger famously declared that by 1985, no child would go to bed hungry. To this end, national and multilateral food security policies and programs have been oriented around the idea of specialization, comparative advantage, trade, and aid-based food distribution programs to consumers, rather than emphasizing community control over food production, distribution, and consumption. So agricultural trade liberalization, concretized through the 1995 WTO Agreement on Agriculture, has decimated national agricultural systems, particularly in developing countries. The FAO estimates that nearly 30 million peasants have lost access to land since the mid-1990s, and people are still losing land in what is known as the global land grab, not only for mining and oil, but increasingly for agriculture. Some estimates indicate 227 million hectares have been taken away from small-scale producers in the last decade. Today, global grain trade is concentrated in just 5 companies, and national agricultural systems, particularly in Latin America, are oriented to specialized export-oriented crops: soybean and sugarcane in Brazil, where I work, peas and broccoli in Guatemala, flowers in Colombia. We've also seen a race to the bottom in terms of environmental and social practices accompanying trade liberalization, with a corresponding rise in deforestation, environmental degradation, and increasing levels of malnutrition. So food is thus increasingly mobile, and food prices are increasingly volatile. Global food imports were up 25% in 2011, $1.3 trillion, a second jump after major food crises and a proliferation of food riots in 2008 and 2009. So how has all of this mobility in terms of food production and food trade affected the right to food? We've seen periods of food price volatility. We've seen food riots across the globe, tortilla wars, bread and rice riots. We've seen urban people whose wages aren't rising accordingly to be able to accommodate these rising food prices. We've also seen rural peoples who produce export-oriented crops also suffering hunger because those rising food prices aren't trickling down to producers. Okay? So today, about 1 billion people still face hunger in the world, according to the WTO, or according to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So from a human rights framework, the right to food, from a distributionist perspective, must be guaranteed by states. But the consolidated international trade model hasn't worked very well to protect the right to food, to enact it. So Bruce Derneen, a Canadian food systems activist, is critical of much of the food rights discourse. He argues that the human right to food has transformed, the sort of discourse around the right to food has transformed a human necessity into a legal claim to be granted by some authority or another. And he says that it actually may put communities in a position of dependency. So what about the rights of communities to decide about how they want to get their food and to protect their environments? How can they actually reduce their dependency to face challenges around hunger? So there's a tension around the rights of consumers to access cheap food and the rights and responsibilities of producers to produce food that is healthy, sustainable, and accessible. So the grassroots critiques have emerged around food sovereignty, particularly sharpening in the mid-1990s, the early 1990s, focused on the importance of community farming systems which were threatened by these neoliberal agricultural policies that have reduced support for national agricultural systems and facilitated the dumping of food commodities. So in 1993, a coalition of agrarian movements, so peasant social movements, small farmers, fisher folk, artisanal, indigenous peoples, and pastoralists got together and discovered some common interests in trying to challenge the current global food system. So today, this organization called the Via Campesina encompasses 150 national organizations from 70 countries and represents about 200 million farm families, peasants, and fisher folk. In 1996, at the next World Food Summit in Rome, the Via Campesina presented an alternative concept, which is the concept of food sovereignty, or the right of local populations to define their own agricultural and food policy, to organize their food production and consumption to meet local needs, and to secure access to land, water, and seed. And the framework of food sovereignty encompasses a new set of value relations and approaches to rights. It's concerned with the survival of small farms and ecological sustainability. It's concerned with decision-making, ways of participating in food policy decisions at various scales, from the local to regional to national and international. Sustainable food production for the local community is seen as an act of citizenship, contesting neoliberal conceptions of citizenship as primarily accessed through participation in a global market. And in response, we've seen new institutional measures emerging, constitutional provisions and amendments in several countries, laws, policies, and programs in others. This is a slide from the community center in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where I live, which is the poorest postal code in all of Canada, one of the most places where we have the highest levels of poverty and a number of social problems. And this slogan painted on the outside of the building represents the alternative demand from the consumer's perspective for a human right to food that is now transformed from a demand for simple calories and nutrients to more specific claims around culturally appropriate, dignified, fresh, and local food, especially in instances where the state, from a rights framework, having the responsibility to provide these choices through food social safety nets. So locally produced food in this framework is thought to be more nutritious and better tasting. In addition, the circulation of locally produced food maintains the food dollar in a local economy. Food sovereignty advocates argue that food aid, when that means dropping in subsidized commodities from elsewhere, can actually undermine the local economy by taking away jobs, both farming and urban processing jobs, from local communities. The food sovereignty framework thus seeks to connect this urban demand for the right to a particular kind of food with the demands of rural producers to produce food in an ecologically sound manner, in a process of creative procurement based on a social economy. So in contrast to the right to consume food, the focus of UN approaches to food security, the food sovereignty framework emphasizes the right to produce as a necessary precursor to the right to eat. So to this end, to access the material resources needed to engender a food sovereignty model, including land reform, access to technology, and access to seeds, agrarian social movements have begun to link their these demands for localized resources to local, global, and transnational advocacy networks for social, economic, and cultural human rights. So the Via Campesina, for example, now operates on two distinct fronts, distinct but connected. To address the transnational character of the need to protect the framework of food sovereignty as a human right, the Via Campesina has embarked on a mobilization for an international convention on the rights of peasants. This document was developed through a set of regional and international workshops and conferences between 2000 and 2008 by peasants themselves, so not by lawyers, not by UN officials, and it's now been brought to the UN and is being debated in the General Assembly. The Convention on Peasants' Rights challenges the inability of current international rights conventions to protect peasants' rights, arguing that the violation of the rights of peasants damages the world's ability to feed itself. On a second front, member organizations are working to implement changes in national constitutional frameworks, legislations, and programs to enact the right of peasants. So food sovereignty advocates argue that governments have a key responsibility in addressing food insecurity. Food transfers and high food prices haven't combated hunger, especially among the rural poor. So connecting the right to food with the right to produce can make a difference in four critical aspects of food security. Through availability, improving availability of food through strengthening local production chains, improving access to food by connecting with local development and alternatives and increasing incomes to purchase food, especially for urban people. The idea of utilization that by acknowledging the negative health effects of the nutrition transition and the turn to a Western diet based on imported food, addressing the lack of access to healthy, culturally appropriate foods that has led to a rise in obesity. And finally, the food sovereignty framework addresses the issue of vulnerability. It addresses the impacts on local food systems of the combined food, financial, and energy crises. So food sovereignty advocates suggest that public social safety nets, including school feeding programs and public procurement, government purchasing for hospitals, food banks, schools, etc., can make a difference in stimulating the local supply of culturally appropriate and sustainably produced food, thus affecting availability, access, utilization, and vulnerability. So how has this come out in practice? Here's 3 examples of where the food sovereignty discourse has made its way into national constitutions. Ecuador was one of the first countries to explicitly recognize the right to food sovereignty, and there's many places where it's mentioned in the Ecuadorian constitution. Ecuador hasn't done much to formally implement this right. There's a lot of activity at the grassroots and in the NGO sector, but this is a country where you can see that the establishment of a right hasn't necessarily led to its implementation. In Bolivia, the 2009 Constitution has a number of articles that mention food sovereignty, and of interest here has been the emphasis on the obligation of state development policy to preserve food sovereignty. So there's specific references to the need to consider food sovereignty issues in negotiating international trade agreements, and the need to transfer funds, for example, from the hydrocarbon tax, which under the Morales government have more of that revenue has been brought to the Bolivian people. That revenue specifically is aimed at school feeding programs and other agricultural programs. Brazil, which probably has one of the most advanced food security programs in the world, has recently put a food sovereignty stamp on some of these programs, with food sovereignty language appearing in recent laws, decrees, and programs. So to finish up, I'm just going to give a couple of examples of food sovereignty initiatives in Bolivia and Brazil that explicitly challenge the ontological separation of the right to food from the right to produce. And then I'm going to give some assessment of the challenges to implementing and domesticating a diversified food sovereignty model based on the principle of international peasants' rights. So school feeding programs have been in place for some time globally, with extensive participation from food aid providers such as the UN World Food Program. One estimate suggests that in 2008, 22 million children benefited from subsidized school feeding programs in 70 countries. So we can talk about the benefits of school feeding, obviously increasing school attendance, increasing child nutrition for development, and actually helping children to stay in school for a longer period. When based on imported food, school feeding doesn't tend to address broader community food system breakdowns, leading to, which have resulted in poor household nutrition in rural communities, especially in the early years of life. And Rachel, I'm sure, will talk about some of those important issues. Imported food also doesn't address community resilience, economic development, or land rights. So in response, in very recent years, there's been a shift to the concept of homegrown school feeding, or the idea of supplying local food to schools that's culturally appropriate, fresher, and more nutritious. So the World Food Program has had a major turnaround on this. Last year, more than 60% of its global budget was allotted to local food purchasing. For example, in Bolivia, World Food Program funds, along with funds transferred to municipalities through the hydrocarbon tax, provide purchased rations, but they also provide funds for municipalities to purchase food from local farmers. Since 2008, in response to the food price increases, Bolivia has taken some further actions to increase food supplies in local markets, as well as stimulate local production. One example of this is a 2011 law called the Law for the Community Agricultural Production Revolution, which includes provisions for strengthening the participation of small farmers, protecting the environment, so payment for ecological services, and improving the consumption and commercialization of small-scale farmer products through marketing cooperatives and public procurement programs. So is this food sovereignty? I've had a couple of students study these programs for their thesis work, and some of the challenges to looking at a school feeding program in Bolivia from a food sovereignty framework. One is that there's such a history of providing commodity foods for schools that there's a system in place that's really hard to break out of. There's also sometimes not access. There isn't sufficient local production to be purchased, that the agricultural community has suffered such a breakdown that what used to be produced is no longer produced. And then finally, a third challenge was interesting. There was a specifically food sovereignty named program that tried to reintroduce traditional foods like quinoa, amaranth, and other native grains into the school breakfast program in El Alto, an urban area in Brazil. And what the evaluations found is the students didn't like that food. They didn't like the traditional food because they had become accustomed to the Western diet, the nutrition transition, and what in Bolivia is known as junk food. So that's a significant challenge to re-establishing a food sovereignty framework when you have communities that have changed their taste, not necessarily for foods that are more nutritious or more appropriate for environment and social concerns, but it's a very real, anybody who has children know it's really hard to get your kids to eat something that they don't want to eat. So that's a challenge of re-educating the palate towards a more sustainable food system. So in Brazil, well, the struggle for food sovereignty is arguably much more developed. Brazilian social movements have been on the front lines of promoting the food sovereignty framework, principally through agrarian social movements working with land reform, participating in the Via Campesina and scaling up their struggle to meet the concerns of urban people in Brazil for more healthy food. The Brazilian social movements have taken food sovereignty discourse into forest code reform. They've taken it into national pesticide campaigns. There's a poster here that says the poison is on the table, and it's actually a film that's shown in a public education campaign around the health impacts of industrial agriculture, particularly around pesticide use. And of course, in Brazil, there's active mobilization around the global land grab, especially around the environmental and social implications of the rapid increase in soybean production and export. So agrarian movements in Brazil have always demanded a national guarantee of production and have asked for the government purchase of food for social service programs. And what we've seen is that, I'm missing my photo there. But the photo that's missing is a photo of the president of the Regional Food Security Coalition. And so this is a government council that is concerned with food's actual security programs. And these are called Conselhos, municipal, state, and national level councils on food security. They've been around since the 1980s. In the last 5 years, the Conselhos have had a considerable shift towards a food sovereignty discourse. They were not adopting that discourse until very recently. And they have been principally responsible for bringing, they're primarily urban, they had been up to this point primarily urban organizations, and they have been very effective in bringing in and connecting peasant demands for guaranteed markets into school feeding and public procurement programs, hospitals, food banks, and popular restaurants. So they collaborated with social movements in the elaboration of a 2006 law that actually requires that 30% of food purchased for schools be purchased from local markets. So really trying to get at that issue of cultural appropriateness, regional foods, regional palates. In Brazil, there's quite a diversity in what people eat in different regions, and they're trying to actually meet that in terms of nutrition and food security. So for example, the picture that's missing is a picture of the president of the Mato Grosso Council, and she's actually works for a child welfare NGO, but she meets on a regular basis with people like Fia, who's a member of the Landless Workers Movement, who's standing in her field of papaya plants, which are sold through a cooperative arrangement to local school districts. And then her daughter eats those foods when she goes to school. So it's really a way of closing that separation between the producer and the consumer. So this is an example of homegrown school feeding. Most of you have probably heard of Brazil's social welfare program called Fome Zero, or Zero Hunger. Interestingly, Fome Zero has a huge budget. Its yearly budget for last year was double the budget of the entire Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, about $3.7 billion US. And this includes a lot of programs, including conditional cash transfers for school attendance, but it's also within the same policy package includes credit for small-scale farmers, It includes public procurement programs that are specifically oriented to agrarian reform settlements, and it includes purchasing for food banks from small-scale farmers. So this program overall, including the conditional cash transfers, have been credited with bringing 20 million families out of poverty in the last 7 years. Part of this is pulling rural people out of poverty by supporting their local agricultural and food systems. So for example, schools will pay more for food that's organically produced. So this facilitates organic certification by small-scale family farmers that may not be able to pursue that certification without that extra payment. So what are the challenges to this framework in Brazil? Despite this enormous budget of Fome Zero, the elite agricultural and agribusiness sector gets more. For example, between 2003 and 2007, state support for large-scale producers in Brazil was about 7 times that was awarded to family farmers. This is despite the fact that family farmers represent almost 90% of Brazil's farmers overall, and they produce about 75% of the food that Brazil actually eats. Brazil is a country that actually is pretty much food self-sufficient, and most of the food that's eaten in Brazil is produced by small-scale farmers. In 2008, for the 2008-2009 harvest year, the agribusiness sector, which primarily in Brazil is the sugarcane and soybean sectors, received 6 times the budget of the Bolsa Familia conditional cash transfer program. And at the same time that we're seeing an increased budget for social welfare and actually strengthening rural agricultural systems, we're seeing a decrease in actual land redistribution and land reform. So if anybody's interested in land reform, I can tell you stories about that. It was one of Lula's main campaign promises to continue distributing land to landless farmers, and it was almost completely halted over the last 8 years. So to conclude, food sovereignty is presented as an alternative framework that can that's a framework that's alternative to the domination of global capital in agri-food systems. It represents an agriculture that can feed the world and cool the planet. It has growing civil society support as a unifying movement that brings together human rights movements, environmental, labor, fair trade, women's, and other progressive movements. The Via Campesina, which I mentioned, has more than 150 members in 150 organizations in 70 countries, 200 million farm families. This does not even count the urban supporters and movements that are pushing for this closer link between urban and rural food initiatives, including the examples I gave of homegrown school feeding programs. Much has been made of the influence of international trade agreements on national agricultural policies and on increasing world hunger. Of the almost 1 billion undernourished people in the world, 75% are concentrated in rural areas, and half of these are farming families. The obligations of signatories to the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights are to take positive actions to ensure the right to food. According to the proposed International Convention on Peasants' Rights, these actions include those that facilitate the right to farm and the right to fair and equitable and environmentally sustainable food production and trading systems. So my research suggests that the implementation of food sovereignty initiatives that protect the right to produce, including the right to agrarian reform and local food system development, represent a strategic shift in protecting the right to food.
No, I think I'll just move this forward a little bit. So thanks very much, Hannah, and I really think that my talk will build on what Hannah was discussing. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me here. It's really exciting to be in Chicago. This is my second time to Chicago, and I was here 10 years ago, so I'm very grateful for the invitation, and it's been a lovely day of meeting with students and getting to know more about what you do here. So I have depicted here on this first slide a picture of a friend and a long-term colleague in Malawi. This talk will focus on my work in Southern Africa in a country called Malawi, and her name is Esne Ngwira, and she is standing in a field of mucuna, which is a leguminous crop that is edible. It's also a cover crop, so it protects the field from soil erosion, and it fixes nitrogen, and when you bury the crop residue, it improves soil fertility. You might be able to see, it's probably hard to see, but she has a slight smile on her face, and I chose this photograph because I think it shows a certain amount of dignity and pride in what she's accomplished. She's a widow. She has 5 children. She also looks after several orphans from her siblings who have passed away, and she's in her 50s, and she's been able, by using different agroecological practices over the last decade, to be able to produce enough food for her family and to send her kids to school and to have good nutrition in her home. And she's also openly HIV positive, and so she's really proud of her accomplishments. And she's talked to me about how she has felt that taking an agroecological approach to addressing food security has given her hope and has given her a feeling that she will be able to achieve food security and improve nutrition in her household. So I thought it was a good example of a very concrete way that families in very difficult circumstances can achieve food sovereignty in their communities. So I am going to briefly talk about the dominant model of agriculture and the means for achieving food security that you would all be familiar with, and then I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about this alternative approach to addressing food security, and in doing so achieving food sovereignty by using a case study of the work that I've been involved with in Malawi, which is a participatory research project that is using sustainable agriculture and agroecological methods to improve food security and nutrition in northern Malawi. And so I'm going to talk about some of our findings and some of our achievements, but at the same time identify some cautions and some future research activities that we have been engaged in the last few years. So the dominant model of agriculture is the dominant model of agriculture used here in the United States, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it is using external inputs that are dependent on petroleum, so fertilizer, pesticides, mechanization, largely monoculture, and to produce food, and much of that food is produced for export. And this is the model of agriculture that has been dominant in North America and Europe and increasingly in the global south, and it is the one that is advocated by many international institutions as the means to achieve global food security. The logo in the bottom corner here is that of the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which is a major multi-million-dollar initiative that has been spearheaded in the last 6 years or so to promote this approach in Africa as a means for achieving food security in Africa. So an alternative approach for addressing food security, and one that I'm going to be talking about in reference to the work in Malawi, is an agroecological approach. And this approach really builds on the way ecological systems operate. So first of all, using organic material to improve soil fertility, building soil biota, and using mulch, using crop residues, using manure as a means to improve organic material within your soil. And instead of relying on pesticides, using natural processes, so everything from sticky traps to catching as you can see here, catching pests with a net, or using predator-prey interactions, so attracting predator insects that will eat the pests that you're having a problem with, or intercropping. So a number of different strategies for addressing pest and disease problems. And then emphasizing resource conservation, so soil conservation, water conservation, and increasing biodiversity as a means for achieving food security. And finally, your overall strategy and agroecological strategy is one that draws on what we know about biological systems more generally. So building on synergies within that biological system, looking at the way nutrients are recycled within that system, and enhancing biodiversity as a means to achieve your food production. And this is an approach which has been promoted by most recently by the FAO and by the UN representative for the right to food, Olivier De Schutte, as the way forward that we should be using as a means to achieve food production globally. A study done by hundreds of scientists and representatives of government in 2008 called the IAASTD also recommended this approach as really the viable way forward for how we can feed our global population. So this isn't, although it's an alternative model, there are many scientists and representatives of different organizations globally who think that this is a viable way that we should move towards in the world. So I'm going to focus on Malawi, and Malawi is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a highly rural population, so about 85% of people in Malawi rely on their own food production for at least part of their food source. It is a very poor country in southern Africa. The average GDP is about $200 a year. It is also a maize-based cropping system, which is the dominant cropping system in eastern and southern Africa. So it's a place where you can ask the question, what is the viable way that this population can feed itself? And it's also a place that's quite interesting because in the last 6 years or so, the government has really spearheaded the dominant model of agriculture as the way forward for feeding the Malawian population. So this is a poster that was up all over Malawi, and the man in the right-hand side of the picture is the late President Bingu wa Mutharika. He just passed away this last month, and of a heart attack, sadly. But while he was president, he initiated a fertilizer subsidy that was a subsidy for both reduced price of fertilizer and reduced price of hybrid maize seed. And he really built his political capital on this subsidy, which reduced the price of fertilizer and hybrid maize seed by 2/3. And it was made widely available to initially the majority of smallholder farmers across Malawi. And initially, the international financial institutions were against this policy, but they quickly fell in behind it, and along with a lot of donor support. And in doing so, the country became highly indebted and also became in a bit of an economic mess. And the last few years, initially, Malawi was trumpeted as a place where hunger had been solved. And it was called the Malawi Miracle. And organizations like AGRA and the Gates Foundation held up Malawi as the way forward for Africans to feed themselves through fertilizers and hybrid seeds, essentially. But in the last few years, it's faced an economic crisis. There's been a foreign exchange shortage, and there's been a major fuel shortage, as well as increasing authoritarianism on the part of the government, which has led people to stand back a little and say, perhaps this approach is not the way forward for a country that has to import all of its fertilizer, and that fertilizer is increasingly expensive. So one of the reasons why Malawi is interesting, not only for those of us who work there, but for people more generally interested in food security, is because you see very much questions about what is the best way to feed a population that is quite poor and that has tried different models for addressing food security. So the work that I've been involved with for the last 12 years is based out of a hospital in northern Malawi, and it really began to grapple with the question of food security from a child malnutrition standpoint. So in the late 90s, you saw the rising price of fertilizer, in part because of economic policies imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on Malawi. And farmers who had come to rely on fertilizer found that they were unable to produce enough food for their families, and they were admitting children with severe malnutrition to the hospital. And the hospital was looking for alternatives to fertilizer as a means for supporting food security in their community. And so we developed a pilot project initially to test alternative options for addressing food security, and these options were sort of a basket of options that had been tested on research stations and in controlled conditions on farm, but hadn't been really tried out by farmers under their own farming conditions. And the idea was it was going to be a pilot project where farmers would learn these different options and then experiment with them on their own farms, and then we would track to see what the outcomes were, not only in terms of soil fertility and food security, but particularly the hospital was interested in child nutrition outcomes. And so initially we trained 30 members of what we called the farmer research team who learned about these different options, and then anyone in their 7 villages could join the project and learn about them and test them on their own field. And there were also village plots where farmers could see all the options displayed, and those plots were managed by the farmer research team. We also had field days, we had farmer exchanges, we had farmer apprenticeship days, we had recipe days, so many different sort of teaching opportunities that were really based on farmer-to-farmer, community-based approaches. And we had a longitudinal design, so we are doing both pre and post as well as control intervention design model, so we could compare how the situation was changing for farmers, both in comparison to their neighbors, but also in comparison to where they were at the beginning of the project. And we used all kinds of different measures, everything from agricultural measures to measuring children's weight and height, to interviewing farmers about what changes they were seeing in their community. And it was an iterative process, so as things came up that we realized we need to be tracking this, we also included some additional measures as required. And we did a lot of participatory workshops to check in with farmers about what they were experiencing. So what were these different options that people were trying out on their fields? This is a picture of a woman who's growing pigeon pea, and that's the tall, shrubby legume in the background. It's a legume that is sort of a woody shrub, and it produces a small pea that is edible. You can also use it for fodder for your goats or cattle. It has deep roots that pull up nutrients from deep below the surface and help other crops growing in the area. And it's nitrogen fixing, so if you bury the leaves then and the roots, then you have nutrients available to maize the following year, to corn the following year. In addition, people grow intercropped with that groundnuts or soybean, and groundnuts is in this picture, that's peanut, and both of them are harvested, they're harvested at different times of the year, and that's another advantage of this system. You harvest groundnut earlier, so you have a nice protein-rich, oil-rich food available earlier in the season that also has legume or residue that you can bury in the field to improve the soil fertility, and then later on in the season you harvest pigeon pea, so you have an extension of the season. And you rotate this combination with maize so that you have crop rotation, which also reduces problems of disease and weeds as well. In essence, it's quite a simple option, and but you're building on agroecological principles in using this option. And this was the most popular option. There were a number of different options that farmers could choose from, but they liked this one the best because these two crops are edible. So you're not setting aside a field and just growing something that's going to improve soil fertility down the road. You're growing food at the same time that you're improving soil fertility, which is really viable for farmers where the average land availability is about 1.1 hectares per household. And what we were able to track is that farmers were really excited by these options. I didn't include a graph of the number of people who joined the project, but we started with about 185 farmers in the year 2000, and by 2004 we had over 2,000 farmers who had joined the project, and we now have thousands of farmers who have received a small amount of seed and a little bit of training and then have taken it from there. And what this graph shows is that they were quite willing to expand the area devoted to legumes over time. And depending on the type of legume, depended on how much they expanded it. We also found differences by gender in terms of how much they were able to expand it. And we are also able to demonstrate improvements in maize yield. So you're not just increasing legume availability, but you're also increasing your primary grain crop, not only in comparison to just not using fertilizer, but in comparison to maize plus fertilizer alone. So it is addressing food security at the same time that it's improving the quality of the diet. And what farmers started to talk about as well is that this isn't just a means to improve soil fertility and food security, but in years when we have drought or poor rain, our soils that have been improved by these legumes are responding better to the poor rains. And that makes sense from a scientific perspective because the soils have more organic matter, which means they're better able to retain moisture under times of drought stress. And so what we've been able to document is that this simple, in some ways very simple strategy of incorporating a number of different crops that are leguminous into your cropping system, so using biodiversity as one of your strategies to address food security, has multiple benefits. And so this graph shows you're increasing soil cover, so that reduces soil erosion. You're increasing protein available within the household. VCR is value cost ratio, so you're reducing the price of the farming system to the household because you're not purchasing as much fertilizer. If you do use fertilizer, that fertilizer is utilized more efficiently by the plant because the soil is better able to retain the nutrients and retain water, and so you use less fertilizer when you do use fertilizer, and you still are able to maintain grain yield. So another aspect we looked at is, are people maintaining high levels of crop diversity over time? And this table shows that there's a statistically significant difference in terms of the number of farmers who have increased the number of crops they grow compared to control households. And these are farmers who may have joined the project. On average, they joined 8 years ago, and they're still maintaining a higher number of crops in their farming system. And farmers are relating this notion of crop diversity also to climate change, because they say when we grow more crops, if one fails because of poor rains one year, then we're better off. If the next year there's heavy rains, another crop might do better. So this is an important strategy for conditions of uncertain rainfall. We also identified social issues that you really need to pay attention to in relation to this strategy. So there were a number of social issues we identified. I'm going to talk about two. One of them was, we were saying to farmers, in order for this to improve soil fertility, you need to bury the crop residue early after harvest. Normally it's women who harvest the legumes, and normally it's men who prepare the fields for planting just before the planting period. So in asking them to bury the crop residue early, we are either asking women to take on a new task during the harvest period, or we are asking them to go home to their husbands and say, honey, do you mind going to the field and burying that crop residue now, because it's going to improve the soil fertility. And in a country where you have very unequal division of labor, you have high levels of domestic violence, and in northern Malawi, land is passed through men, so women aren't considered to be owners of the land, so men have a lot of control over the decision-making within households. That's a lot to ask women to do. And so initially we were not seeing high levels of crop residue incorporation. What the farmer research team said was, well, we need to organize some promotion of this. So they said, we're going to have crop residue promotion days, and they went to the villages as a team and said, okay, folks, today's crop residue promotion day. Come see what we're going to do. Hey, men, take a look at this. We're burying the crop residue of this legume because this is your fertilizer. Hey, this is your job. This is your fertilizer. It's worth a lot of money. You should bury the crop residue. It sounds simple, it sounds, kind of silly, but this is what they organized, and we were able to track over time a very dramatic shift in agricultural practice. This is from 2009, but we've consistently seen this result where farmers were burying crop residue early in households that were participating in this project, and in control households in neighboring villages, they continued to burn the crop residue just before planting. So another social issue that was quite important was initially we were seeing high, increases in legume production, but women were saying at the workshops, well, this isn't really helping us out, because our husbands, sorry, Ben, but it was the husbands, were taking the groundnuts and they were selling it and using it for beer or for other things that weren't a benefit to the household. And so there were a lot of other sensitive kind of household and community issues that came up in our work. And so we decided to organize what we called agriculture and nutrition discussion groups, which brought together older men, older women, younger women, to talk about some of these issues, initially in the small group, only with someone of your own age and gender, and then through a facilitated means, discussing it in the larger group to try to raise some of these bigger issues. And we found that this was a kind of revolutionary idea in some ways, because farmers hadn't had that opportunity. People hadn't had that opportunity to have this kind of unstructured sharing of ideas in that way. It was different for them, particularly across gender. That wasn't very common. Having men sit around talking about ways to improve child nutrition, that was quite unique. And they also found that it was a means to bring up some of these difficult issues in safe ways. And so what we have found is that this combination of an agroecological approach combined with paying attention to some of these difficult household and community issues through different educational strategies has been effective at addressing child nutrition. And what this graph shows is that weight for age, and we found the same with weight for height, for child growth, is improved both before and after people are involved with the project, but also compared to intervention households. And this was a very exciting result for us, because there aren't many studies that have been able to demonstrate that agricultural interventions can lead to improvements in child nutrition. So another component of this kind of agroecological strategy that really draws on notions of food sovereignty is that of community organizing. So the farmers have organized a community seed legume, or a community seed bank for legume seeds, which when you join the project, you have to pay back the following year the seed that you received. So after you've had one growing season, that seed goes into the seed bank, and it gets distributed by the farmer research team to other members of the community. They've also organized Ekwendeni Farmer Association, which is a cooperative which helps them to get reasonable prices for their crops. And in this picture, you see a kiln that they built. This was just this past year, which they used to make fuel-efficient wood stoves, which they distributed to everyone in their community as one way of addressing climate change. So a couple of cautions before you get too excited. We've also found in our research increasing entry of corporate interests into Malawian farms through the seed. So an increasing number of farmers are reliant on hybrid maize seed, and they're buying that hybrid maize seed from the 4 multinational seed companies that sell seed in Malawi. And this is in large part because of the fertilizer subsidy in the last 6 years. A lot of our work in the last few years is focused on climate change, and we did some interviews with farmers and survey work on what are their perceptions of climate change, and farmers are talking about some very dramatic changes in rainfall patterns. So rains that used to come no longer come. They had special names. They came in June, and they came in September and October. They no longer come. When the planting rains come, they come later, and they finish earlier. And when they do come, sometimes there's a break of 2 or 3 weeks where there is no rain. And so under these conditions, it's very difficult to sustain food security. And certainly these findings, which are farmer perceptions of rainfall, would be consistent with what is predicted for sub-Saharan Africa with rising greenhouse gas emissions, and namely increased droughts, increased severity of droughts, and increased unreliability of rainfall. And I've mentioned gender inequalities as a major concern and something to really pay attention to if you want to address food sovereignty. We also have, in the case of Malawi and many parts of Southern Africa, very high rates of HIV prevalence and a lot of other health issues, be it malaria or diarrhea or so on. We asked this question 2 years ago during the last growing season. Did you or anyone in your household fall sick for 1 week such that it affected your agricultural activities? And about 50% of people said yes. So that is something that we really need to pay attention to in thinking about how to achieve food security and food sovereignty using these approaches. And I've spoken a bit about some of the concerns of women more specifically with regards to how household resources are used. And this is a quote from an interview I did in 2009, which really addresses that. This woman is saying, "I'm worried about what will happen when my husband sells the crops because he'll take the money and use it for his own benefit. And I'm also worried that he's going to sleep around and he'll bring HIV into the home." So these are an ongoing concern that we need to pay attention to. I've been involved for the last 4 years, or last 2 years, in a long-term project where we're looking at climate change adaptation strategies. I won't talk much about that because I want to make sure Phil has time to talk, but one of the ongoing research activities is looking at different ideas farmers have around climate change adaptation, and one of them is trees. So they've organized community tree nurseries in the last 2 years in 20 different villages and distributed tree seedlings to hundreds of farmers in the area, and they see this as one strategy for addressing climate change in their communities. And they're also interested in small livestock integration as a backup plan if the rains are really poor that year. So this is a piggery that they built that they're pointing to, and it's a communal piggery where they're keeping pigs and it's kept for the village. So I'll end with this slide, and it's similar to the first slide. It's a picture of Chrissy Mbuluma, and I took this picture just in January. And she's also HIV positive, and she's standing in her field of pigeon pea and soybean. And she said she didn't find the work too onerous. She found it viable. And At times when she was feeling sick, she said the people within the project helped her do the weeding of the field, so she found that cooperative effort really important for maintaining food security. And she received one of the stoves that people made, and she said that was really helpful when it was cold. It helped keep her warm. So I'm concluding with this slide because I have cautious optimism about emerging alternatives to the dominant model of agriculture in the world. And although I'm aware of the multiple forces that can work against those alternatives, and I'm also aware of the importance of taking gender and other inequalities seriously at the household and community level, I would conclude from our work that using agroecological methods to improve food security increases local control, sustainability, and resilience of the food system, and thus is a food sovereignty approach. And by building farmer knowledge and paying careful attention to local inequalities, we can have a place that experiences food sovereignty. So thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Jamie for taking care of us so well, and Kathy for taking care of us up here with the questions afterwards. Maybe if I talk long enough, we won't have time for those. I wanted to address this global conundrum. I will start with a couple of... I've just realised I've got this device. I'm going to start with a couple of slides. The first one is a slide that gives you some sense of who's feeding the world. I think this is a very dramatic distribution, and it's very easy for us in the industrialized regions of the world to forget that 50% of the world's cultivated food is produced by peasants, and then of course there's 12.5 coming from forests, etc., and 7.5 from urban food, which I'll talk about in a minute. I also want to show this picture here that captures the inequality in the world. This is from Ankie Hoogveldt's work, and it gives you some sense of the inequality that the world currently has. And I think it's quite extraordinary when you stop and look at that those of us with credit cards belong in the middle, the bankable crew, and we're surrounded by these two other categories. Now, the reason I'm putting these two slides back to back has to do with this kind of comment, and that is that that 70% of peasant provisioning exists on the margins of the corporate market system that we've been talking about so far, but a growing portion of that 70% may well be the key to surviving the future. I just came up from Detroit this morning. Yesterday I spent the afternoon. I'm working with a group of people from different sites around the country on urban agriculture, which is not my speciality. I don't know very much about it, but I'm learning. But we visited the D-Town farm, and the Detroit Black Food Security Network met with us last night to talk about what was going on in Detroit. And what I picked up just from that quick experience was this really strong sense of bringing the countryside to the post-industrial city. In many ways, Detroit represents, in some people's minds, an image of America's future, where with jobs going offshore, with unemployment rising, with more and more cities with unemployed or underemployed populations and hungry populations, people are going to resort to this kind of local feeding program that Detroit so clearly represents. And what they talked about last night with us was the whole process of reskilling urban youth to sort of reconnect with the land. And we have to remember that anyone who lives in a city intergenerationally eventually came, originally came from the land. And so what they're trying to do is to sort of recapture that connection with the land, but in the city. And build neighbourhoods and communities around that whole process as part of what I would argue is food sovereignty. So my argument today is that food sovereignty represents a paradigm change Food sovereignty redefines food security from a trade-based to a rights-based concept and practice. That nations and communities should have the right to consume rather than trade the food that they produce. And that farming and Indigenous peoples should have land rights to secure farming practices, local food provisioning for fellow citizens, and to encourage ecological stewardship of the kind that both Hannah and Rachel have talked about. Now, the conundrum for me is that just as the right to food, that's food sovereignty, emerges as a powerful vision, it's competing now with an alternative investor-driven right to food, which I'm characterising as the global land grab. And what I'm arguing here is that there's a global infrastructure of agro-exporting that I think Hannah mentioned in her talk earlier, which I'm calling the right to trade, and that's institutionalised within the WTO's Agreement on Agriculture. It's facilitating a land enclosure by foreign firms and states that's ensuring a new mercantilist vision of food security, which is overriding the free trade system via direct investment in offshore food production. So instead of firms and countries relying on the market, they're actually going offshore and directly capturing access to land so they can grow food and biofuels and what have you, and I'll talk about that. So what I'm arguing is that the land grab reformulates food security as a neoliberal atavism, and by that I mean that neoliberalism is about the market, of course, and I'm arguing that these guys are overriding the market, but I'm also arguing that neoliberalism has opened up countries, particularly indebted African countries, Latin American and Asian countries to a lesser extent, to the attractions of foreign investors coming in and leasing and purchasing their land. And so there's a very interesting conundrum that's associated with this whole process. So what was food security? Well, Hannah talked a little bit about this, and I'm not going to go over it very much. She mentioned the vision that emerged after World War II, and the FAO certainly had a notion of a kind of a decommodified understanding of getting food to people who were hungry across the world in the post-colonial period. But that vision shifted to feeding the world with agro-technologies and dietary and nutritional sciences, and the whole emphasis on calories that Hannah mentioned also. The key shift, I think, was that the US overrode the UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and the World Food Board in 1946, that were supposed to be public agencies sort of managing food aid as well as managing the world food system, and substituting a bilateral PL, Public Law 480 food aid regime by which the United States, by this time, as a consequence of the coming out of the 1930s depression and the stabilization of American agriculture after the Dust Bowl in the 30s, the US was producing huge surpluses of food, and so one of the convenient ways of dumping those surpluses was to sell those surpluses at concessional prices to strategic states on the Cold War perimeter in the Third World. States like Korea, South Korea, India, Pakistan, Israel, Egypt, Colombia, and so forth. And so it became a very effective way of getting food to those countries to essentially pacify urban populations, to build loyalty, and in George McGovern's words in the late 1960s, to anticipate future markets once those cultures became addicted to Western foods, and Hannah explained that process also. And that's in fact what happened. So after the food aid regime was set up to redistribute US food surpluses, the Europeans then copied that model, because through the Marshall Plan the US had brought the American industrial food system to Europe, and so by the 1970s Europe was beginning to produce surpluses itself, and so there became this kind of big trade war between the US and the Europeans, which has continued up to today. And during this period also the green revolutions were set in place in the 60s in particular, growing staples for urban populations, grains in particular, and then followed with genetically modified technologies later on with high-value foodstuffs that have produced this kind of global supermarket that we're now very familiar with. And so those are all part of the agro-export infrastructure. In 1974, there was a crisis, a world food crisis. Some of us in the audience will remember that food prices shot up at the same time as oil prices were going up. Now food insecurity had emerged from the collapse of this food regime. In other words, what had happened was the US was selling more and more of its surplus foods to Russia, to the Soviet Union rather, through an agreement by President Nixon, and of course that took food away from the third world countries, and prices shot up in the Western world. And so there was a new World Food Summit that was established in '74. The World Food Program was set up to provide aid, and then on the side, parallel, complementing that, was the elaboration of a trading system where the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs met in the mid-1980s to try and stabilize the international food trade, because the US and the Europeans were trying to dominate different markets, and they were competing with one another, and prices were incredibly volatile. So that Uruguay round that began in 1986 culminated in 1994, and then in 1995 the WTO, with the Agreement on Agriculture, was set up to sort of institutionalize and stabilize this whole process of agro-exporting from the global north. And I'm not going to get into the details of that right now. But the dominant ideology underlying this was essentially articulated at the beginning of the Uruguay round in 1986. And this, I would argue, represents the notion of food security as a privatized system whereby food is moved from granaries or bread baskets in the north through the device of transnational food corporations to hungry people and countries in the global south. That's essentially how the system was set up. Another way of looking at it is the issue of dumping, which I'll come back to. So what's interesting is that during this period that public expenditure on agriculture in the global south fell 50%. And those figures are quite extraordinary. If you look at the direct payments to OECD farmers, that's the northern farmers, in 2006, 125 billion just in 1 year, whereas only 3.9 billion are going to the public expenditure going to the global south. The World Bank, in its report in 2007, actually admitted deep in the report that structural adjustment programs established in the 1980s and through to the present day essentially dismantled the elaborate system of public agencies supporting small farmers in the global south. Now, what's interesting about this whole process is that agriculture was off the radar now from 1980 right through until 2007, when the World Bank's World Development Report, which comes out annually, refocused on agriculture. After 25 years of ignoring agriculture, all of a sudden it came back into the center of World Bank reporting. And of course, this was a period of food price crisis and food riots, etc. It was a happy coincidence, but I think it tells us something about how agriculture and food are really returning to the center, and we're beginning to recognize that in fact agriculture is the foundation of civilization in several different ways. So this cheap food regime I'd mentioned about the dumping, and what's interesting about that, and I think this was mentioned earlier, that what I call the corporate food regime was a system whereby subsidies in the north, paid for by taxpayers, enabled surplus food to be dumped at artificially lowered prices in the global south, driving farmers off the land. And this low price was institutionalized by the WTO, and it has led to the displacement of smallholders going to slums or agro-export estates. 1990s, the FAO figures were conservative. Hannah mentioned 30 million. I'm being a bit more conservative here, saying 20 to 30 million. Mexico, the figures are about 2 million campesinos dispossessed since NAFTA was brought in, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994. It's quite extraordinary, you know, the debate about so-called illegal immigration from Mexico into this country always ignores the enabling factors, which have to do with the reduction of support for Mexican farmers as a consequence of signing onto NAFTA by the Mexican government, the privatization of communal lands, which were established after the Mexican Revolution earlier in the 20th century, the incredibly heavily subsidized corn coming from Iowa that is dumped in the Mexican markets, making it very difficult for small farmers to compete in the market. So these are all fascinating structural forces that have wrought considerable havoc on the small farmers across the world. So we have this crisis conjuncture I alluded to earlier, smallholders on their heels, rising hunger levels, rising food and energy prices, food riots, global warming, financiers looking for non-industrial profit frontiers, development institutions looking for re-legitimation. The markers of this period, I think it's fascinating that all of these reports, and this is not all of them, but these are the key ones. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment came out in 2005, the Stern Review in 2006, and the Stern Review made the point that climate change was the greatest market failure of all time. And the World Development Report I just mentioned, which refocused on agriculture. The International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development report came out in 2008, and Hannah mentioned that. And then the World Food Summit in Rome in 2008, which I went to, but I was part of the alternative forum, the Terra Preta Forum, which was sort of meeting alongside the big shots. I mean, we did have an audience in the FAO, but this was a meeting of CSOs, social movements, agrarian land rights movements, etc. And what we were trying to do was to put pressure on the FAO and the World Bank and the corporate leaders to take very seriously this crisis in food prices, and it was pretty much met with deaf ears, just as the ISTAD report was also, because as both Hannah and Rachel have mentioned, I think agroecology was a central part of the ISTAD report, basically arguing that business as usual is no longer an option. That's a direct quote from the report. And it's in this context that land grabbing exploded, and by this year, over 200 million acres, I think Hannah mentioned 227 acres, approximately the area of Western Europe. This gives you an idea of the spiking of land grabbing. I mean, land grabbing is not new. We know that it was essential to colonialism, and of course, we're sitting on grabbed land right here in Chicago. And I'm from Australia, and of course I'm very conscious of the fact that the white settlers grabbed the land in 1788. But nevertheless, I think there's something very unique and different about this particular land grab that's going on today. Well, in the middle of the food crisis, the New York Times had this editorial, which I always find fascinating, because they made the point that cooking oil became too expensive for very poor families who grow much of their own food but have to buy oil in which to cook it. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm bringing this up. Well, if you look at crude oil and palm oil here, and palm oil is cooking oil, right? You look at the, from 2007, essentially, they are totally connected in the, this sort of synchrony of prices, which tells you something about how food and energy has become incredibly integrated now. And what's interesting about that is that Hannah pointed out that industrial agriculture is so dependent on fossil fuels. I mean, it's extraordinary. When Al Gore came out with his Inconvenient Truth, I don't know if you remember, but there was no mention of agriculture in there. And agriculture has been measured as being responsible for at least 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So what that tells us is not that Al Gore was ignorant, but that public discourse about the role of agriculture has been remarkably ignorant. And then Jeffrey Sachs came out with a new book called Commonwealth, and I didn't buy it, but I went to a bookstore and looked it up, and found that when he was measuring the sources of greenhouse gas emission, No mention of agriculture, and this is a couple of years later. It's extraordinary. So it just tells us about urban civilization, that we totally ignore the land where our food comes from, because it comes from the fridge, right? Or from Walmart or wherever. You know what I'm getting at. So this is quite an interesting graph put together by a grad student of mine. Now, oil palm, you can see, is a sort of classic industrial crop. And what's interesting is that oil palm is used for cooking oil. It's also used for biodiesel. So palm oil, the principal cooking oil produced in Southeast Asia, now doubles as biodiesel to supply the rising European demand for green energy. And the Europeans have mandated that 10% of their energy has to come from biodiesel by 2020. First paradox, food necessities for the poorest in the global south become fuel for energy-intensive northern consumers. Paradox 2, the policies addressing energy and climate crises encouraging diesel exacerbate food and environmental crisis. It's been shown that biofuels, other than sugar, essentially don't produce sufficient alternative energy to offset the emissions that those industrial crops produce, and that's quite extraordinary to think about that we're talking about using these alternative green fuels when in fact we're not really solving the emissions problem. But we're also upsetting the environment even more with the industrial crops, and we're taking food away from hungry people. So the US also has its mandates for biofuels, and this gives you some sense of the externalities that are associated with biofuels. This is just giving you some sense of the figures associated with corn production, the extraordinary influence that US traded corn has on world corn prices. And when the US government under George Bush mandated rising ethanol use in this country, corn distilleries went nuts. Corn prices, well, they didn't go nuts, they went corn, but corn prices shot up, and farmers who are growing wheat and soy shift to corn also because they're getting subsidies for this. They're getting high prices for it. So it has this kind of cascading effect, and this is one of the reasons why the price spike in 2007, 2008 was so dramatic. And those are the estimates there. The World Bank estimated the US responsible for 65% of agflation. I can't remember who it was, Hannah or Rachel mentioned farmers. Hannah said that the trickle-down effect of high prices for food didn't reach the small farmers. Those that did have the trickle-down effect found that they were being swamped by rising seed, fertilizer, and agrochemical prices. I mean, the profits that were made by the agribusiness company during that crisis were extraordinary, and I don't have the figures right here, but if someone wants them, I can get them. This, I think, sort of captures the issue of biofuels that I like to call them agrofuels to remind us that they're about displacing food crops. But the underlined sections, I think, are important because they show, I think, the way in which an open market system in the world food regime and these mandates for biofuels naturally lead investors to invest in biofuels at the expense of local populations having access to their own to food that they could grow. So here's your average Chicagoan, right? We don't have these kind of people in Ithaca. So in the context of this, the land grab becomes increasingly important, and people are developing coalitions to address and fight the land grab. I'm involved in trying to set up an anti-land grab consortium in the Americas later on this summer, because I think that we feel that it's a really threatening vector that threatens to undermine the progress that's been made by food sovereignty movements around the world. This gives you some sense of the states that are buying and leasing land, and here we're looking particularly at the East Asian countries and the Middle Eastern countries that are concerned to obtain sufficient food to pacify their urban populations in particular. And if you think about the Arab Spring, a good deal of the Arab Spring was caused by rising food prices, and one only needs to go back and look at the recent history of Egyptian agriculture and see the way in which the Egyptian government has substituted feed, grain production and livestock production within Egypt, and has imported more and more of its basic grains from offshore, so that what's being produced in Egypt is feeding relatively wealthy consumers, and the poorer consumers are dependent on food importing, which of course becomes problematic when prices go up and the big food exporting countries like Argentina and Vietnam and Russia in particular put export bans on in order to retain the food for their own populations. So the whole process has, again, this cascading effect, which is quite fascinating. So the new land grab, the patterns are, over the last decade, 60% has gone into biofuels, 20% to food, 20% to other areas. 70% of land grabbing is taking place in Africa. 2007, biofuels were the fastest growing segment of world agricultural market. And it's quite extraordinary that my teacher's insurance pension fund is investing in the land grab, and so I'm a land grabber also. So the world food crisis led to these export bans, intensified land grabbing, and the land grab is capitalising these new agro-export zones of bioresource grabs, speculative profit, and carbon offsets that I'll mention. So here's another one. Last year in the New York Times, Oxfam produced this report showing that this particular company that puts up eucalyptus plantations to sell carbon credits to polluters back in Europe was enabled by the Ugandan state to evict 20,000 people from their land. And this is not an isolated pattern, isolated episode. This is becoming a pattern. There's a new plan in the works to exchange African soil for carbon credits. In other words, for investors to invest in improving small farmer productivity around conservation farming in return for carbon credits, which will be sold on the carbon market to polluters back in Europe. It's an extraordinary connection that actually puts agriculture at the service of this fictitious carbon market, which is really not helping to reduce carbon emissions. But it's financially very profitable. So you have states in the World Bank helping to reclassify peasant land, you have offshore investment by financiers, and you have these interesting conglomerates, this recombinant capital across auto, energy, chemical, agribusiness companies, and they're investing in these different commodities. And it doesn't really matter what commodity you're investing in. You invest in the commodity that commands the highest price. And what I call this sort of indiscriminate cropping, because what it's basically saying is that what's being produced on the land, it doesn't really matter so long as it's profitable. And this has a huge impact, obviously, on hunger. These are some of the bioeconomy products that are part of this bioeconomy that's emerging. It's becoming very profitable. There's a shift that's going on away from the fossil fuel economy, the attempt to use plant-based products as substitutes. Now, the bioresource grab that I've been talking about represents a transition from, and this incredibly elegant quote from Via Campesina, the massive movement of food around the world is causing the increased movement of people. Back in 2000 they said that, and I'm arguing that we should be rephrasing that now to the massive movement of capital or carbon credits around the world is forcing the increased movement of people. I mean, the two things are working together, obviously, but it's interesting to think about what's happening in that regard. It's not so much about food anymore. It's more about what you can earn, what kind of value you can get from the land. There's institutionalization of these various codes of conduct, which I don't have time to talk about. The RAI is the Responsible Agricultural Investment principles that the World Bank has hammered out. The voluntary guidelines are being put forward by the FAO in a much more progressive way. They're looking after gender equity issues. They're trying to privilege small farmers, to protect land tenure on the part of farming communities and common lands and things like that. But these are only voluntary guidelines. They don't have the force of law. The UN Rights Rapporteur has referred to this code of conduct production as responsibly destroying the world's peasantry, which I think captures the point very well. This is just a quote from the voluntary guidelines to regulate land grabbing that just came in this year in March. And you'll notice that everything is voluntary. It's in the language of obligations, and down the bottom, the voluntary guidelines are designed to strengthen the recognition of customary property tenure and address gender inequity. Now, I'm showing you this slide because I think that the guidelines represent certainly an advancement on the World Bank's RAI principles, but they also signal a huge struggle that's going on in the FAO that has to do with protecting the rights of smallholders across the world. And this is my last major slide here. The FAO is undergoing these deliberations, and I've been involved in these in part, not on a big scale, but it's been very interesting to watch this unfold in the last 2 or 3 years. There's a promising trend to protect small farmers. The Committee on Food Security was rebuilt about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's part of the FAO. And what's interesting about that is that they, instead of just having member states have votes, they now allow civil society organisations to have a voice in that committee, which I think is an extraordinary development, which was pioneered or pushed, driven by the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, securing this right to food principle. And then we have the Human Rights Rapporteur on the WTO reform, arguing that provisions of the Agreement on Agriculture treat food security as a deviation from the objective of agricultural trade liberalisation. So his whole shtick right now is to argue that the AOA is now redundant, and that it needs to sort of catch up to the post-food crisis world that we're experiencing right now. And he's pushing the minimum human rights principle. The question for whose benefit is at least as important as the question how to produce more. And I'm finishing off by making the point that, ironically, the land grab threat is concentrating the paradox of industrial agriculture by empowering a global forum in Rome, as well as food sovereignty movements, as a paradigmatic alternative. And somebody asked me to make some mention of the food sovereignty movement in the United States, so I took this from their recent platform. It's pretty much pretty similar, I think, to some of the ideas of food sovereignty that both Hannah and Rachel have talked about, but very much emphasising the importance of anti-racist movements in the urban centres in this country. And that is Malik Yalini in the top right corner there. He's the sort of director of the Detroit, the D-Town urban farm that I visited yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great. And I know you all three know each other, but you should feel free to talk amongst yourselves as well. So I have lots of questions, and we don't have much time, so I'll just ask a couple of them. But I think I want to start with a more sort of broad conceptual question about the idea of food sovereignty as a framework. And one thing that's really striking about the discourse around it is a kind of close attention to specificity. That is, a close attention to place, to community, environment, especially to history, right? So to argue that not all food, for example, is equal, right? That food has locality, it has history, it has community. And so what this introduces, obviously, is the sense that there's an alternative value system, right? There are other kinds of values that come into play, in addition to values which can be reduced to quantities, right? So whether that quantity is money, or whether that quantity is calories, right? That there is a kind of irreducible historical, cultural, or local kind of element, right? And that strikes me as a kind of interesting parallel to discussions in environmentalist circles, right, where there have been attempts in order to sort of sell the value of natural environments to put a dollar value on, ecosystem services, right? So to actually reduce these, quite incommensurate value systems to a kind of number in an economic discourse. And which completely loses the specificity of a particular location, for example, to say that the ecosystem services of this wetland are such and such. It says nothing about what it means to communities, or what it looks like, or how you met your first boyfriend there, or whatever the story is. So I wonder how the sort of dominant paradigm, if this is at all. If you have some commentary on sort of engaging the dominant paradigm of food security with ways of doing it without losing this kind of sense of an alternative sets of values, right? So everyone's kind of alluded to that, but and I have follow-up questions if that doesn't make sense necessarily.
So how would the alternative framework of food sovereignty preserve that cultural diversity? That's what
Or
you're asking?
how to engage with the large international players, governments, and the sort of the global food system, right? Without necessarily, or maybe that's the right solution, right? Is to speak in the language that's understood.
Some of the things that have been sort of scaled up are these ideas of regional labeling, denomination of origin type labelings, especially in Europe as a region. One way is to value, champagne can only be called champagne if it's produced in a certain area. This has been sort of applied to cheeses and milks and different kinds of meats, and it's been a way to get actually quite a bit of economic value attached to these cultural specificities. That has become then exported. A lot of these now, Parma ham is exported at huge profit to elite, slow food, gourmet consumers in North America. So there's a certain danger in sort of trying to put that economic value on these very unique products, because then when they enter that global food chain, they become inaccessible. Quinoa in Bolivia is a perfect example. People can't afford to buy quinoa in Bolivia because it's become trendy and sort of as a healthy food in North America, and almost all of it. The New York Times last year estimated 90%. There aren't great figures on this, but the estimate is 90% of quinoa produced in Bolivia is exported. So people can't even buy it. It's not even if they had the money to buy it. And people who are growing it aren't even eating it because it's become so valuable that they're now exporting it. So it's a hard question to answer, because at a certain point you don't want people to stop growing quinoa. How do you capture that value within a local system without depending on the economic value being attached to it?
Well, and the other aspects of self-determination and community and so on are things which seem to me much more difficult to reduce to a figure. Whereas you could say how much is it worth? People will pay how much more for this particular type of ham than some other type of ham. So then you could say, well, the value added is $12 a pound or something, right? But I mean, the other issues, the issues of the sovereignty issues, really are not issues which are so easily brought
that's
down
exactly
to
what
kind of
Phil brought up in the
value.
land grab. I mean, here you have sovereignty, territorial sovereignty being put on the market. So it actually, those things are all becoming marketized, even those things that we think that can't be. Our citizenship is now marketized through, you're only a citizen if you have a certain income that's measured in GDP. That's your contribution. So I don't know if one of you have another response to that too, but I think that's what's so scary, that everything is becoming commodified in that way, which is a real challenge to a local self-determination framework.
Any other,
Do you want to add to that,
want to
Phil, or-
jump in on that, or?
Do you have a
good.
comment?
Not immediately. I think
Okay.
it's a very difficult question, because farmers groups or other social movements that are trying to achieve food sovereignty are still operating within the global food system as it currently stands. So you can't. It's difficult to get away from some of the dangers of commodifying things. But I think that what food sovereignty approach is doing is trying to not make everything about the economic value, but to re-embed food systems within local communities and to make people more aware of the cultural value, the nutritional value, the social connections of food, and in doing so, not make the dollar the sole reason why they are choosing to eat some foods over another.
So,
I'd say a couple of other things there that I was interested in hearing Hannah talking about quinoa, and what's really interesting about that is it's not simply that people in the global north are pulling quinoa from Bolivia because it's now considered trendy and it's a valuable item to eat here, but farmers themselves have been put on their heels so much by what I would call the food regime that in many cases sometimes survival means having to participate in the short term, at least in this commodity system, at their own peril, because at some point, if that system intensifies, of course, it will undermine their ecological base. So that's a real problem, and I think that ultimately one of the goals of food sovereignty is to decommodify food as much as possible, and if not that, certainly surrounded. I think Hannah mentioned, or maybe it was Rachel, that the idea of re-embedding the economy within the culture, within the society, within social rules, is a very strong part of that. But I think about this issue in a slightly different way, and I think a little bit more apocalyptically, along the lines that the industrial food system is not sustainable, and one needs to anticipate its collapse. We can see signs of it collapsing in lots of different ways. I mean, more and more US farming is going offshore. American farmers are going to Brazil. Land is cheaper there. Their own land has been degraded. Those are some of the signs. Soil fertility is disappearing in this country. So the granary in the United States has a limited future. So all of these issues, I think, are really important. And before you start thinking that I'm just a gloom and doom merchant, what I see is the local food movements that are cropping up all over the place. The CSAs, the farmers markets, the activity, urban agriculture in Detroit, are all signals that people are beginning to anticipate that they need to take care of feeding themselves and feeding their communities, that the governments and the corporations are not going to do it for them. And so I think that there's a lot of hope just in that kind of activity that's going on. There's a process of repeasantization that's going on in California. I have a graduate student who's gone out there to, the guy who made the graph actually, to do research on repeasantization. Young people are going back to the land to grow food for local markets because they're recognizing that without access to land and food, communities are not going to survive. So transition town phenomenon, which emerged in England and is now spreading across the world, all of these I think are parts of a large-scale movement that's happening largely under the radar. Most people are not paying attention to it, but when you look at the data on how much urban agriculture has just expanded in the last decade, it's just phenomenal. So I mean, these are different ways of thinking about how to address the kind of question that Kathy's asking.
great, so you've anticipated my next 3 or 4 questions, which is
That was the
okay, so
idea.
I'll sort of rephrase it. And I want to make sure to ask, and just building on what you just said, ask something that my students are particularly interested in. And that is, I myself work in rural areas of southern India, so the issues of peasants and small farmers and so on very familiar to me. But then, in teaching a class on food issues and urban agriculture in Chicago, and as a non-specialist, sort of how do we think about urban, industrial urban peasants exactly, right? So how do we translate a powerful framework like food sovereignty into a kind of industrial landscape like you find in the U.S. or Canada? And I know that some of you have done some work on that. So that, Detroit, is an interesting comparison, because you might argue, if you want to use the language of collapse, that Detroit collapsed, right? So that Detroit is revived in an amazing way as a consequence, though, of a previous collapse, right? So is that, do we have to wait till everything falls apart? Then when the idea of a right to produce as a precursor of a right to consume, I have a good sense, at least personally, of what that would look like in a rural, South Indian setting. But what does the right to produce look like for our urban peasants? What does the right to produce look like for people on the south side of Chicago?
Can I respond to that? We have a lot of discussion about this in Vancouver, because in Vancouver we have a very, very active coming from Vancouver, Canada, it's a very active urban agriculture movement, and also a very active rural sort of peri-urban farmers who are struggling to maintain their production systems and bringing their food into the city. And on the one hand, in places like Detroit and places like Cuba, where people are growing large amounts of food on vacant lots and actually providing a significant portion of the food for the local food system, the right to access that land, the right to access vacant buildings, the right to access vacant laws, there's a very clear, you can see very clearly where the right to produce comes together with the right to consume. In Vancouver, we have an interesting conundrum where people are promoting urban agriculture, and mostly it's community gardens, and it's very kind of small, pretty, almost token amounts of food being produced. And this has been sort of formalized into a theory and a concept of what's called agricultural urbanism, and is being used by planners, that if we can plan developments that include often token plots where you can plant a few flowers and a few carrots, that this can be an incentive to get zoning and bylaws changed to incorporate more good agricultural land into the city. So it's basically a license to pave. I went to a talk in the city of Surrey, which is the 4th largest city in Canada, and it's a suburb of Vancouver, and it has some of the best agricultural land in Canada. It's in the Delta farmland, it's right at the mouth of the ocean, it's very fertile, and they're just sprawling and sprawling and sprawling. And they brought in Desmond Despommier, who's at Columbia University, who promotes the concept of vertical agriculture, so skyscrapers which contain hydroponics and a very sort of technified food production system, and he's promoting this as a way to address food security, as a way to grow food in the city for people in the city who need to eat food, and his idea that it's all sort of recyclable energy and this whole thing. It's never been tried, so it's hard to say that how it will work. But basically, the mayor of Surrey brought him in to try to convince people in the city council that urban agriculture was the way to go, so that behind the scenes, additional planning could go forward to pave over more rural agricultural land. So we have to think about these things not in isolation, but in how they work together. Like, how does the right to produce, where should be food produced? Where have people traditionally produced food? How have they done so? Is that way of producing food still relevant for today's society? Those are the kind of hard decisions that societies are having to make. Where do we want our food to come from? Who should be producing it? And those are choices, actually, that people have. And that, you see that very clearly when stuff like zoning and farmland preservation programs come to the table.
Well, we weren't going to do that this time for a change, actually. For the first time ever. We're almost out of time. We'll make sure we get a chance to chat with the speakers. Just ask one more question then, I guess, and that has really to do with agroecology, right? I'm a big fan of agroecological frameworks, and as someone whose work is historical on what's sometimes thought of as traditional agriculture over hundreds of years, it's sort of entertaining in a way, or interesting to see the way in which agroecology has given a kind of scientific respectability, you know, to traditional agriculture that's been studied by anthropologists and geographers for a long time. And sort of now we can say in sort of straight up scientific terms, it works. You know, intercropping, pest management, you know, and so on. This is we have numbers now. We can prove it. And there's something so ironic, I think, about education programs that introduce or reintroduce these traditional practices, like intercropping, right? And you know, this is what's the kind of knowledge base. That's the question, actually, is about the knowledge base, right? So this is what's, you know, sometimes referred to as traditional knowledge, or I wonder if there's a kind of agroecology, you know, parallel for traditional knowledge, a way in which, you know, the kinds of long-term understandings that farmers have developed over generations can be made respectable, you know, in a world forum.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because in Malawi, for example, traditional knowledge has been devalued through colonial times, and in the present day, you know, governments have exhorted Malawians to grow like a modern farmer, and a modern farmer is not, using traditional cropping practices. It's using fertilizer and hybrid maize seed, and I think there's a value to using agroecology as a way of merging notions of indigenous knowledge with scientific evidence that these kinds of practices that were practiced in the past actually have, you know, value. There's been tremendous devaluing through colonial practices and through the contemporary age of local knowledges. One of the things that we found in our agriculture and nutrition discussion groups, and I talked about that with some students earlier today, is that about 3 generations ago, farmers in the north of Malawi used to grow a mix of grains, not just maize, but they grew sorghum, they grew finger millet, they grew pearl millet, and those indigenous grains are more drought tolerant, and they grew them as a backup crop to maize. Maize really became dominant in the last 100 years in Malawi, but that had been forgotten. And it was actually in those agriculture and nutrition discussion groups where the older women started to talk about, hey, we used to grow these grains and these were really great for when the rains weren't good, so maybe we should think about trying them again. And that's one of the reasons why you see an increase in sorghum production in the area. So I think linking this agroecological approach to food sovereignty and to indigenous knowledge, I think those are overlapping concepts and approaches.
Okay, just one very quick little thing then about the global land grab. Because I think we've heard a lot about the Chinese in Africa, for example, but not much about other countries, and of course also oil palm in Southeast Asia. So I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about just give us a clearer sense of the overall structure of this land grab, and, you know, who's doing what to whom.
Well, there's quite a lot of controversy about the land grab because the data is very difficult to put together in a systematic way. Just about 2 weeks ago, I think Oxfam produced a report on what's called the land matrix. I'm not sure that Oxfam produced it. I haven't actually had time to look at it because it's in the form of maps that are interactive, and you know, that's not my thing to do interactive mapping on the computer. Wrong generation. But what it shows, if you go and look up the land matrix, is it shows the different sites around the world where land is being taken and who's investing in it and what have you. But there's a controversy over how much of it is actually being used and how much of it is actually just sort of sitting there idly, incurring value. Because one of the things that I find fascinating, and one of the reasons why I think the land grab is so unique, is that it's not simply about China or Saudi Arabia going offshore to gain access to land for food for their own populations, but it's also about biofuels even more. But it's also about land speculation, and I think that tells us something about financialization, that because of the character of the neoliberal economy today, which is premised on not creating wealth but redistributing wealth you stop and think about it, the rising global inequality is phenomenal at the present time in this country. I mean, the Latin Americanization of the United States is just incredible. And it tells us something about so if neoliberalism is about redistributing wealth, not producing wealth, then investors don't have anywhere to go but to look to land as an investment for the long term because of climate change, because of population growth, because of rising food prices, because of rising energy prices, because of water scarcity. So all of those factors, I think, combine to expand the land grab. And so there's a lot of land that's being purchased or leased that is not yet in use. I've been following this. There's a listserv called Farmland Grab, all one word, farmlandgrab.org, that gives out about every 10 days. It gives out a listing of the key articles that have come out in the media all over the world on the land grab. And I'm following what's going on in Australia, and it's quite extraordinary. The Chinese are investing in Australian land like crazy because they know that in the long term that they're best served by having access, even if they're not using it now, by having access to land offshore to feed their population. So it's very difficult to sort of give you a clear geography of who and what is doing the land grabbing, but as a general phenomenon, I think it speaks to a very clear crisis in the organisation of the world food system on the one hand, and in the way in which agriculture is being essentially prostituted to investing with no particular reason other than to earn value on that land. And that to me is, as Ziegler said back in 2007, the UN Human Rights Rapporteur about biofuels, that's a crime against humanity because it's not dealing with how we're going to manage the future, how we're going to feed everybody and not just the rich, which is essentially how the current global food system is organised. Only those people who can afford to buy the food can actually get the food. But 50 to 70% of the world's population are not getting access to adequate nutritious food. So that's a big issue, and I think the land grab is the elephant in the room.
Okay, well, thank our speakers very much.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.